This is a Mark II Ford Focus. Now, if you're thinking about buying one of these, stay tuned because I'm going to take you through all the common problems, show you everything that tends to go wrong with them. Now, if you want to skip all of that and just buy one that you know is already well sorted, this one, owned by us, is actually for sale, but more on that later in the video. Let's go. So first up, let's get our terminology correct. The Mark II Focus was released way back in 2004. That same car was facelifted in 2008 to give us the Mark 2.5 Focus, just like this one. Now, whether you're looking to buy a Mark II or a Mark 2.5, whether it's petrol or diesel, stay tuned because this guide is going to be worth your while. So starting on the engine front, or I should say bonnet front, every Mark II Focus has got this funny little mechanism going on where it's not actually a pull release inside the cabin. You put the key in front here, twist it to the left, the bonnet releases, twist it to the right, and the bonnet should lift. That's all in theory. These are really common for going bad, so make sure the bonnet does actually open. And once we've got that bonnet open, what powerhouse are we greeted by? Well, it could be a few different ones. As I mentioned, petrol or diesel. Let's start with the petrols first. So you were either going to find a 1.4, two variations of a 1.6, we'll talk about that in a little bit, a 1.8, or a 2 litre. Let's start with that 1.4. Now, there was nothing really wrong with that engine, but it was a little bit underpowered for a car of the Focus's size. So generally speaking, I'd be looking at one of the larger displacement engines if I were you. So moving our way up the petrol hierarchy, next in line was the 1.6. Now, as I mentioned, there was two different variations of this engine. The second option having that variable cam timing. Now, that gave you about 15 or so more brake horsepower, so it might seem like a no-brainer. That's the one to go for. Not so fast. The way that system worked is it used a set of dual actuators. Now, these actuators were classed by Ford themselves as wear items, so you had to replace them from time to time. And if you find yourself having to do that, last time I checked, you were about £800 or so for parts alone. I know, sorry. Now, another expense you want to bear in mind is these 1.6s, they use a timing belt, not a timing chain. That means they need to be changed periodically, either 100,000 miles or 10 years. Budget around about £500 for that job. The parts aren't that pricey, it's just quite a labour intensive job. How about the larger engines, the 1.8 and the 2 litre? Again, great engines, no real problems to mention here. They're also chain driven, so there's no belt to worry about, but do bear in mind, they are slightly larger capacity than that 1.6, so expect it to be a little bit more thirsty. Now, here's another real common one for you. I can get you either side here. And that is coil packs. Now, the problem here is the coil pack itself is in real close proximity to the heat of the engine. Over the years, all those heat cycles, it starts to break down the heat insulation inside the coil pack, and yeah, it ends up dying. It's just what happens. Now, thankfully, if it's starting to go, the car tends to develop a misfire, so you should be able to spot that if you're viewing one. It'll be running quite rough on idle. Now, thankfully, the parts and also the labour is not too expensive on that job. Oh, I would say I've exhausted every angle I can get with that bonnet open. We've still to talk about the diesel engines, but I'm going to have a seat to do that. So diesel engines then, what were our options? Okay, so you got the 1.6, the 1.8 or the 2 litre. Now, none of them I would say outright avoid, but each share the same diesel particulate filter problems and exhaust gas recirculation valve problems. Now, that's nothing specific to Ford, by the way. Most modern diesels end up with these types of problems, unfortunately. Intercooler hoses splitting can also be common on these Focuses. Now, if it has to be a diesel that you buy, try and get a car that's post 2009. That's around about the time when Ford changed over to the more modern ceramic DPF design, and it was much better than the older ones. Still get problems, don't get me wrong, but it was much better. Now, here's an interesting little tale for you, and that is, in days gone by, people started to believe, mechanics as well, that the turbos on these diesel Focuses were really quite unreliable. Turned out to be totally untrue. The problem fed back to the injectors. They were starting to leak and fail, and eventually that would lead to little carbon deposits finding their way into the oil feed lines, blocking off the supply, and before you know it, you've got a blown turbo and blowing tons of blue smoke out the back. Now that's why there's so many stories of owners of these diesel Focuses replacing the turbo only for the same problem to reoccur weeks later. I'm not laughing at those owners that put new turbos in their car just to blow them up again. I'm just laughing at how interesting and unusual faults can be sometimes. Cars for you, eh? Moral of the story, on any of those diesel engines, get under that bonnet, have a smell for any fuel, look for any residue on the top of that cylinder head around about the injectors, and of course when you get out on that test drive, be on the lookout for excessive amounts of blue smoke coming out the back. You're probably not going to miss it though if an injector or turbo is on the way out. Now, if I absolutely had to recommend one of the diesel power plants for you, I would say go for either the 1.8 or the 2 litre. Not only do they have that little bit more grunt, but that 1.6 engine, it's notoriously difficult to work on. Now, you probably don't mind that. You're thinking, well, I'm just going to give it to a mechanic to work on anyway. But I guarantee you that mechanic is going to charge you more money to do simple jobs on that 1.6. You want to remove the sump, that'll be half of the front end having to come off. You need a new fuel filler pipe. That'll be the whole subframe getting dropped to do it. There's really odd design decisions being made in that car, and for that reason I would say the 1.8 or 2 litre from a maintenance point of view is definitely the better choice. Yep, I'm back in the car again because it's more comfortable. Now, talking about the engine, that is obviously going to lead us on to talking about the gearbox. Now, I'm going to be brief on this, brief and brutal you could say. There's definitely some information you don't want to miss in this part, but before we get to it, quick favour ask from you guys. If you're getting value from this video, please hit that like button. That's how YouTube recommends videos, and others can get value from this as well if they find it, obviously. Also, we create these buyer's guides for every type of car, so if you tend to buy second hand, this may well be a worthwhile subscribe for you as well, but I'll leave that one up to you. Okay, gearboxes, let's do this. Before we get to it actually, I'll slip this in as well. Not about to turn into a salesman on you, don't worry. I'm just including this because it might be helpful for someone out there. This car is for sale. I can assure you it is a very good car. 85,000 miles, one previous owner. Drop us a line on Instagram or Facebook or leave a comment below if you want some more details. Now, by far the most common and what you're likely to find is either a 5-speed or a 6-speed manual gearbox in one of these Focuses, particularly here in the UK, just like this car has. The 5-speed or 6-speed part, well, that will depend on what engine it's paired with. Now, the other option is the dual clutch automatic style power shift gearbox. And let me be blunt here, I don't do this very often, but do not buy one of these. They are utterly unreliable, unfortunately. I hate to say that, but constant problems. Solenoid failures, clutch failures, soldering failures on the TCU. The list goes on. And honestly, if you view one of those cars that has one of them fitted and it all seems to be okay, again, I hate saying this, but it's probably a matter of time before you're going to be facing a bill to get something repaired. So here's an interesting little problem spot, one you probably haven't seen before. I know I hadn't. It's these. Now, it's not that they don't work, it's that they're not sealed in very well from the factory. So what happens is rainwater starts to seep through here, gets into the engine bay, and certainly on this 1.6, where does it end up? Yep, it ends up finding its way into the spark plug wells, which then fill with water and can damage the coils and the plugs themselves. Just lovely. Now, thankfully, it's not a complicated fix. Usually, a bit of silicone, to be quite honest, will take care of this problem. Now, how about rust? Well, she is an old Ford at the end of the day, so you're going to need to be cautious of that and have a bit of a check. Common places are where the wings meet the front bumper and where the rear quarters meet the rear bumper. Also, sills are a real hot spot for it as well, so have a good check around them. Now, we're going mobile for this next part here. One thing to check, make sure the reverse light is working. Have your mate or the seller or someone put the car in reverse, make sure that's coming on. The switch, which is actually on the gearbox itself, which activates this, can sometimes go bad. It's only about £12–13 from memory for the part, and it's pretty easy to swap out. But yeah, it certainly makes a good negotiation point. Get a bit of money off, keep a bit of money in your pocket. Next up, make sure that boot release works as well. Get in there and have a good feel around for any dampness. There's a couple of different leak points round about here. We can do a separate video on that if you want, and I can show you how to resolve it. Oh, and speaking of leaks, also check in the driver's footwell. Now the reason that this can tend to get a bit wet in here is when the air conditioning drain blocks, it'll tend to feed in here, make the carpet all soggy. Again, thankfully, quite an easy fix, but bring it up with the seller, save yourself a bit of money. Now it's time for that test drive. Make sure you don't do what I've done and leave your little stubby key in the front, flip your badge back over, put it back in the key. And oh, on that note as well, it's not that uncommon, by the way, that these keys can sometimes go a little bit faulty, so make sure all the buttons work on it as they should. Lock, unlock, and the boot release. Anyway, onto that test drive we go. Now first things first, make sure you test out all the electrics, have a good play about, make sure the aircon's blowing cold, all the usual kind of stuff. Next up, when you're actually on that test drive, pay particular attention to how the steering feels. Make sure it's consistently assisted. What I'm getting at here is the pump and also one of the lines that sit behind the radiator can tend to leak. Sorry, the pump doesn't leak, the pump can just go bad. It's the line that can sometimes leak. Either way, it results in the steering feeling a little bit inconsistent in its sort of assistance. So make sure that's not the case. Make sure it's all feeling all right. Now the other thing to check, and this is quite a weird one, quite a weird request, but when you're on that test drive, it's a bit weird to focus on my feet as well, but what you want to do is give that throttle a couple of sharp prods while you're going along, and either second or third gear should do the trick. Now what we're trying to identify there is there's this bracket on the exhaust. It sits right beneath us here, it's on the catalyst, and it can tend to break off. Really common on these Focuses, and when it does, that exhaust is essentially jumping up and hitting the bottom of the car, and you'll hear it. If you stab that throttle kind of sharp, you'll cause the engine to shift, and if it is broken, you'll hear it dunt the bottom of the car. Now again, let you into a little secret. There is a bracket that you can buy. It's available on eBay and stuff, and it's not that expensive. You can put it right. You don't need to remove any of the exhaust system. You don't need to do any welding. This bracket fixes it perfectly. I've used them tons in the past. We'll probably use them tons in the future. And now you know. But again, bring that up with the seller, save yourself a bit of money in that negotiation stage. So it's with good reason that these cars have been a bit of a mainstay on our British roads for almost the past 20 years. As well as being superb cars, they really are quite reliable as well. And when you do tend to get problems, not to say you're not going to get any problems, but you can tend to put them right pretty cheaply and easily as well. So with all things in mind, we award the Mark II and 2.5 Focus a really rather respectable 7.5 out of 10. Now thank you so much for watching. Please do hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and we'll see you next time.